Welcome to our inaugural Stakeholder Preservation Series of the St. Thomas Historical Trust. Can everyone hear me? Thank you so much for everyone coming out this afternoon. This is something that we're going to begin and we're going to do fairly regularly, at least once a month. But we're hoping that the next one will be in next month on the 9th. And we're hoping to perhaps get Warren's brother, David, to be the speaker. But,
you seem like Steve Warren's brother, so I'm not going to ask for any more.
If anyone who has any influence, perhaps they can use it. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce longtime friend and certainly somebody I've always looked up to, and I'm so thankful for him to be here today and start this series for us. Mr. David Knight, historian extraordinaire.
Thank you all. Do I really need the microphone?
No.
It's, I'll try to speak up. Nope. Is it?
No, it's fine.
Just made myself a few notes to start with. First, certainly thank you, Executive Director Eric Miles and board and members of the trust for having me here. It's an honor and a pleasure. Long overdue. And I need to start by stating that what I express, the opinions and viewpoints expressed in this presentation are my opinions and my opinions alone. Okay? Many of you know that I do serve on the Historic Preservation Commission, and it's been a wonderful experience. I'm in my second year on that commission. It's given me a lot of first-hand knowledge of preservation issues in the territory. But I'm not here today representing that commission or as a member of that committee. I also want to recognize fellow committee member, Matt Eckstein is here. Let's see. I have some handouts. I don't know if everybody saw them, but my wife Lana here has them. And basically, this is just a glossary of terms. Not all these terms show up in the presentation, but I think they're terms that just everybody should be familiar with if we are going to have a discussion of preservation and preservation issues. First, I also want to thank my partner of nearly 30 years now, Lana, who has suffered through my creative process many times over the years, particularly over the last few days when I'm putting this presentation together. Before I launch into the presentation, I've asked my son, David over here, if he would come up and do a reading of a quote, a literary quote by
Italo Calvino.
Italo Calvino. Okay, and he read this quote to me the other day when we were discussing this presentation, and I just thought it was so poignant and set a tone for history and preservation, and thought, and cultural perspectives, that I'd like him to come up and just read it quickly before we launch into the presentation. So, David Knight, Jr.
Good evening, everybody. So I think that the reason why my dad has asked me to read this quote is because it expresses something a little bit about nostalgia, which is a large factor in preservation efforts. It's from a book called Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, who is one of the most well-known Italian writers of the last century. This book is basically a revision of Marco Polo's travels, his travelogue that Calvino did. And he turned in all the different cities that Polo talked about into fantasy cities, and each one kind of dresses a factor of the human condition. And this one's kind of about nostalgia. The city is called Morilia. In Morilia, the traveler is invited to visit the city and, at the same time, to examine some old postcards that show it as it used to be. The same identical square with a hand in the place of the bus station, a bandstand in the place of the overpass, two young ladies with white parasols in the place of the munitions factory. If the traveler does not wish to disappoint the inhabitants, he must praise the postcard city and prefer it to the present one, though he must be careful to contain his regret at the changes within definite limits, admitting that the magnificence and prosperity of the metropolis Morilia, when compared to the old provincial Morilia, cannot compensate for a certain lost grace, which, however, can be appreciated only now in the old postcards, whereas before, when that provincial Morilia was before one's eyes, one saw absolutely nothing graceful, and would see it even less today if Morilia had remained unchanged. And in any case, the metropolis has the added attraction that, through what it has become, one can look back with nostalgia at what it was. Beware of saying to them that sometimes different cities follow one another on the same site and under the same name, born and dying without knowing one another, without communication among themselves. At times, even the names of the inhabitants remain the same, and their voices, accents, and also the features of the faces. But the gods who live beneath the names and above places have gone off without a word, and outsiders have settled in their place. It is pointless to ask whether the new ones are better or worse than the old, since there is no connection between them, just as the old postcards do not depict Morilia as it was, but a different city, which, by chance, was called Morilia, like this one.
It's striking that when Eric asked me to come do this talk, and Gail, where's Gail? I'm sorry, I forgot to thank you for your invitation, but it's Gail, Gail Lindwall is the lady who communicated with me and invited me to do this, and the person who's in charge of setting up the lecture series. So thank you. When Eric and Gail contacted me and suggested I do something on the subject of preservation, I was a bit hesitant because it is a huge subject, you know, and I knew that it was going to take a lot of time to organize my thoughts, and it has. And in the process of putting together this program, it's gone through a number of different versions. And what I realized is that this subject is so complex and so vast that we could really never even get anything more than just the essence of it in one presentation. So I have to say that what we have here, we are painting with a very wide brush, okay? And as we go through the programs, the program will reveal multiple issues that I hope we will be able to address in future presentations. Before the actual presentation starts, I have a little tradition that I do when I put together presentations, is particularly if I'm speaking to a group that doesn't necessarily know me or my family, I like to acknowledge my family and my family heritage. And I begin with a picture of my mother and father. This is where our family journey in the Virgin Islands really begins, back in the 1930s, with my parents who came traveling as tourists, and I gotta say historical tourists too, because within our family documents, my father was an amateur genealogist, as had been his father and grandfather, and the family had passed down papers. And within the family collection were letters, or one particular letter, that was really a treasure, about one of our ancestors visiting Government House in St. Croix and going to a ball with Governor Vento. And I think this is probably what sparked my dad's interest in coming down and looking around. I don't have a copy of it here, but one of the very first pictures that they took when they came to the islands was my father and mother standing on the steps of Government House in St. Croix in front of the room where the ball had been. I have some notes that he took on that trip, and he refers to the letter. So.
David, you ever consider using a microphone?
Yep. Okay?
One moment.
Okay. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's my mom and dad. This is my mother in Tortola and my father off of Camille Bay on St. John. And the other little tradition that I do when I put together a presentation is I do a dedication. And I'm going to dedicate this presentation particularly to 3 individuals who were really instrumental in shaping me in my life, informing me about the environment that I was trying to negotiate and the life that we lead here. And all of these people in my youth and formative years were my heroes. They weren't Mickey Mantle or John F. Kennedy or Superman or something like that. These were my superheroes. And so I'd like to call their names. Mr. Herbert Samuels of One St. Jonian, Ms. Mildred Hodge from Tortola, and Mr. Richie Richardson from Anguilla. All culture bearers, steadfast culture bearers, and mentors for me. Now, before we can really get into the presentation, I just need to do a little background. And this has to do with the handout that we've just handed out, is know the language of historic preservation. If we're going to talk about preservation, we need to know the definition of preservation when it comes, not just the standalone word, but preservation when used in the context of historic preservation. And according to the National Register of Historic Places Guidelines, preservation is defined as the act or process of applying measures necessary to sustain the existing form. And that's key, existing form, integrity and materials of an historic property. Work, including preliminary measures to protect and stabilize the property, generally focuses upon ongoing maintenance and repair of historic materials, features, rather than extensive replacement and new construction. Also key. New exterior additions are not within the scope of this treatment. However, the limited and sensitive upgrading of mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems and other code-required work to make the properties functional is appropriate within the preservation project. Now, realize, this is the definition and guideline for historic preservation as laid out by the National Register of Historic Places Guidelines. That means this is the law within our historic districts. Okay? Now, there's other terms, and most of them are on the list. I would just ask you to look down the list quickly before we move on, and if anybody has any questions on any of the definitions, we ought to talk about it before we start.
I have one question right off the bat.
Sure.
If a house or a building's been changed over the years and a person comes in, which happens to be something I'm doing now, and we're trying to take it back in some ways to the original, but not changing everything. For instance, when certain houses have added closets and have made changes to the room, but they happened 50 years ago. and we're not changing. Is preservation mean that you take all that out to the way it was when it was originally built? Which,
Says existing form.
so as
Now,
at the point,
Generally speaking, Historic Preservation Commission and Historic Preservation regulations within our historic districts do not get involved with interiors. Okay? We're more concerned with keeping the historical facade and context of the building as part of the town.
so what's the difference then between preserving what's already existing and returning it, taking something out that isn't original and returning it back? What's the difference?
That's called a restoration. So
Okay.
you're restoring it back to something,
Okay, gotcha.
which is generally encouraged, especially if you know the historical context that you're restoring it to, right? I mean, I think one of the things that a lot of people make a mistake when they think they're doing a restoration project is then they'll slur their time frames and accept things from different periods that they want and then put a flat screen TV in the middle of it. You know? So, I mean, you can have all those things. But I think that it's preferable, just from a preservation standpoint, that you determine a context for your structure. That's why doing a little history of the structure is important. Okay? Pick a context, a period that you think you're trying to portray, and try to target that. Yeah, I mean, it'd be virtually impossible to restore things, back to their original state in many cases and make them livable in this day and age.
No, if the closet was 100 years old, it was, is that deemed historical? Like you said, the different time things. It's hard to, that's one of my challenges with the historic commission is, well, what date are you using as a benchmark here? I finally got them down to like 1857, which helps my work, because that's at least a benchmark, but if that closet was done 100 years ago, I consider it historical.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I think that generally the commission doesn't get involved in interiors too much, unless there are built-ins that are historic and so on.
Well, even on the exterior, for instance, I worked on a building in 1837, and then they added a third floor in turn of the century, 1905. Totally different construction, totally different facade, and then the house took that shape or that form, right?
Existing form. Okay? So if you met it that way and it's got historic elements from different periods, then you should embrace those.
A few more years, I'll be historical.
Yeah, you are.
I'm good with
But
that.
now we're not really talking about definitions of words. We're actually getting into the conundrums and issues of preservation, which is what we're going to be talking about.
Just stuff like that.
Sorry. Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. Okay. Yeah.
And there's one, excuse me, but there's
Sure.
one example that came to my mind immediately that deals with this issue, and that is Madison's home, or is it Monroe's? Madison's home, where they had the, now the name went right out of my head, the famous wings on there from Mrs. DuPont, and they decided, which was very, old, and they had the National Trust of Historic, Historic Preservation had to decide, are they going to keep the DuPont wings or take it back to the original home? And they decided to take the wings off, which was very controversial because it was famous people and it was historic. But
Yeah, but you've got to decide how you're going to frame a historical context.
right.
And how does that fit into the narrative of not just the individual place, but the cultural landscape and the place that it's inhabiting. Just because one owner had, a historic,
Place and
considered to be a historic person, okay, maybe doesn't fit in with the broader interpretation or narrative of the place.
And for the purpose that they wanted, I guess. But
So, individual issues, but let's move on because we got a long way to go here. And before we can enter into a meaningful discussion on preservation issues, we must define just what it is we're seeking to preserve. So first we have the terms. And then, and again, these are my opinions, okay? So jump in if anybody disagrees and so on. But to me, when we're talking about preservation issues, these are the three categories that pretty much all those issues are, okay? We're looking to preserve the natural resources, materials or substances such as wildlife, minerals, forests, wetlands, waters, pasturable and arable lands that occur naturally, natural environment. Okay? Historical resources. Historical resources include prehistoric and historic archaeological sites and materials, as well as the built environment, which includes historic sites, buildings, structures, objects, and districts. Okay? And then the one that we refer to most commonly, I think, that pretty much encompasses everything except for some of the natural, is cultural resources. And we have a wealth of cultural resources here in Virginia. And our towns and districts are primarily interpreted around the cultural aspects of it, as well as the historical. So cultural resources are the collective evidence of the past activities and accomplishments of people. How have we affected and impacted that natural landscape? Buildings, structures, objects, documentary sources. That's our paper record, our archives, our paintings, sculpture, statues, and also our oral. I think our oral resources have to be, interpretation have to be included in our cultural resources. Features, locations, landscapes, and traditions. Okay? So those are, when we talk about preservation, historic preservation, these are the things we are seeking to preserve. Then, of course, the problems get a little more problematic. Then we must ask ourselves two additional questions. How do we go about preserving those things? And as a sub-question to that, is preservation a function of government? Or is it a private sector responsibility? That's an issue. And then why do we preserve things? Is preservation a natural human response, or is it a contrived strategy for retention of collective memory? To me, the answer to those questions is they are components of both. They are components of both. I believe that we do need some degree of legislative regulation for historic preservation, but I also feel that the overall responsibility for making that relevant is a private sector responsibility. It's when organizations like the Historic Trust, make their voices heard on decisions and issues relating to preservation. And individuals can call, write editorials in paper, other groups can get together, church groups, clubs, When we start to input in, it is the only way then the government can respond to making the legislative part relevant and responsive to the needs of the community. So, why do we preserve? I think we all have a natural tendency to collect things and keep them. Things that mean something to us. In a way, down to our most basic human responses, we're kind of like squirrels putting away nuts. Is we want to collect the things that give us sustenance, give our life meaning and fulfillment. And I also think that it is a contrived strategy. It is a strategy that humans have used historically and continue to. Basically for self-edification, self-glorification, My culture, what is our story? We preserve this because that's important to us as a people, and it tells our story. When we're gone, that'll still be there, and people will know we were here. So, to me, the answer is
May I
that.
interject something now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
This is the Ford.
Yes, it is the fourth.
Was the Historical Trust involved in advising and so forth before this restoration project started?
I don't know. That's the trust.
All right, or whoever. The point I'm
You
making,
talking about the fort?
yeah,
Yes.
okay. This is built by, I believe, the Danes. But all the forts, whatever they were, and they built forts, the color of the forts, also the one in St. Croix, were sort of an off-white, a dirty white, you may say. They were never put on this red stuff. I have asked people, and they say, oh, as long as I remember, that was always the color of the fort. That might be as long as they have lived, but now when we are spending so much money on it, this looks pretty. I mean, God, right now it sure is red, Tuscany red, almost red. But this is not. Now that is the outside. This is not the original color.
We can answer that for you, Margie. And yes, you're right. It is not the original color. They went through meticulous. I just actually happened to be there, not as part of the Historic Society, with Sean Krieger. I've been a documentary filmmaker and photographer for many years, and my father before me, and we get called in on different projects. And we just happened to be there as they were analyzing. They were going back through layer after layer after layer. And they went down to the original layer, and the original seemed to be almost a yellowish.
It could be a little yellowish,
Yes.
but yeah, that might have been a yellow tint in it.
And do you remember when they had a grid work of different samples of paint on the fort, and they put it out to the public, and they had announced that they were going to go to the original color, but the outcry was everybody wanted the fort to be red. So that.
So there
Michael,
goes
do
the
you have
historical thing.
And Michael.
Yeah, well, the thing is,
Here, this is exactly the same issue we were just talking about here.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Well,
because I think that the overwhelming determination here is that if you were restoring the fort back to its original shape and structure, you would paint it the original color. But that clock tower and that entranceway and that northern wall is contemporary with a late 19th century period. And when those architectural elements were added to the fort, and the fort was significantly, the whole character and architecture was significantly changed, it was painted red.
Yeah, okay.
So if we are going to keep that clock tower, then we need to paint it red.
Yeah.
If we're going to lick down the clock tower and tear it all out and put it back to some
And
point
open the
in
original
future,
entrance.
we would have to then look at what color it was then.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So that's the end of that issue.
Sorry.
so is it true
I'm
then,
being funny.
I know you're not here from the historic preservation period, or are we looking at each structure and determining which time period
You'd
you're
have to
going
look
to?
at each structure.
Sure.
You have to take it
So
on a
the
case by
commission,
case
for
basis.
instance, would look at each structure and say, well, this was built in such and such a time.
However, districts and district landscapes are treated a little differently, okay? We'll get there.
Thank you. I'm sorry I agreed.
No, that's all right.
No, it's a good
We
point.
haven't even started the presentation yet. That's a good preamble. I mean, those are the things that we had to get out of the way,
Yes.
you know, before we can really start discussing it. And because, as I say, there's very complex issues here, you know, and we're not going to be able to talk about them all and get into the detail of each one of them in one sitting. But I'd like to acknowledge and welcome Administrator Shelton in the room. Thanks for coming.
No problem.
You're just in time. Can you see?
Yes, I can.
Okay, the preservation conundrum. I love these Jack and Lana photographs from the 1940s. And I chose this one because it's such a lovely overview of Post Office Square and so on. And you'll notice that there's signage in there that we would never allow today in the historic district. Those two big red Coca-Cola signs. And just look at the beautiful, there's something about the tone and color of Jack DeLong's photographs. I just love his color photographs and his back there. But look at the overall tone of town, how it all blends. So, the subtitle for this presentation was When to Preserve and When to Let Go. And I saw that and I was like, that's kind of an odd question for me because we never let go. You know, I mean, even if we rebuild something. But I take let go to have implied development. So when do we preserve and when do we develop? And I thought I'd start here at my home. And I think it's significant that this postcard, this photograph was taken by Ron Morissette Sr. in 1960. And Ron, of course, is the father of lawyer Brian Morissette, who was a partner and got caught up in this whole issue of the development of the Summers End project in Coral Bay. And he and his other partner, Bobby O'Connor, someone else who I've known all my life, we've all known each other our lives, and some other members of the St. John New community, kind of butted heads with popular opinion on this issue. And I got to admit that I fall somewhere in between. Okay? But we have to understand that for those of us whose image and memory of Coral Bay is that, what Coral Bay is today doesn't really seem a lot like something you'd want to preserve in place or save. So, I understand that thinking. So, I've added an ending to the question of when to preserve, when to let go, and that is when to restore. Because sometimes we don't want to preserve something in place, okay? Sometimes we want to make it better, okay? And you can't always go back. To restore Coral Bay to its natural state at this point in time would be cost prohibitive, to say the least, and impossible. You get into a lot of issues of displacement. What would you do with the people and the things that are there, you know? So if you don't want to keep something the way it is, if you don't like it the way it is, or what it's become, and you can't restore it, you need to hope to develop it into something better than what it is. So development is not necessarily a bad thing, okay? Responsible development is what we need, okay? But we have issues on St. John, preservation issues that deal with displacement. And we're going to get into that. But what everybody has to understand is that a lot of the problems that St. John is dealing with today are because they made a determination years ago to preserve a large portion of it, therefore displacing people off the land and constraining them to a small area. Okay?
Which brings up my question. You said that this was not necessarily good as is, but that was not the impression I got from people who didn't want the development, was they seem to like it this way.
Exactly.
So
There's a difference of opinion.
Yeah, so what you
Okay.
said with, from the postcard before to this, it's changed, but that doesn't necessarily mean everyone thinks that's bad.
No, no, and, you know, I personally don't think it's so bad, but I think we could improve upon it, okay? Given the fact we can't restore it. Because here's the issue. The issue, and we're going to get into this now. The issue largely leads to one of our first major conundrums that we're going to explore here, is when you displace a population off the land, okay, there's only limited amount of land left for the community to grow and thrive, okay?
Was anybody really displaced? That's my point.
Well, there were quite a few people displaced, yeah.
You mean they were looking to be paid so they could leave to go to New York?
No, I think, let's not get into the micro details, okay? Let's look at the big picture, okay?
Can I just add one thing,
Yeah.
David?
Yeah, sure.
I don't think it was the land area that was the problem. It was the 144 pilings and what they were going to do.
Nobody is advocating for that here, okay? Nobody. So just bear with me, okay? The problem is when you displace or constrain the area of a place that can be developed and can be lived in, okay, then you need to manage the development in that area properly so that it, number one, so that it develops in a way that's relevant to the needs of the community, okay, and has sustainability, okay?
But
No.
Mr. Knight, there is an environment, he's dead now. He did the power of power, I can't remember, it's embarrassing now when I make this statement. But he had a phrase, he said, environmentalists are not against development, blindly against development. We are against blind development.
Beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful.
That's it,
Yeah.
that is the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. I agree. These are discussions of bigger conundrums, and right now we're going to deal with this person. If we had to pick one representational poster child to illustrate the complex issues surrounding preservation in the USVI, it would be very hard to choose between the island of St. John and the island of St. Thomas. St. John is unique in that back in the 1950s, it was decided that a huge portion of that island was to be set aside and preserved as a national park. Although this decision initially faced significant local opposition, it eventually garnered broad-based support on the grounds of St. John's evident need for economic development. Preservation for economic development. Well, right? Over the years, the relationship between the National Park Service and the native St. Johnian community has often been strained and at times contentious. In the end, balancing the needs of an expanding residential community with the imposed constraints of mandated preservation has proven problematic, revealing seemingly unsurmountable differences in perspectives and expectations. Today, the St. John community faces ongoing struggles with the prickly issues of displacement, dispossession, disenfranchisement, gentrification, and a translation of cultural values. Big picture. That displacement issue is big, and you know what? It doesn't go away. It gets worse. As communities expand and people are faced with leaving to find a place for themselves, this community, or staying and trying to negotiate this new reality. There's more and more people. We want to make space for them in a very small portion of St. John. The amount of St. John that we have for that expanding community is finite. We don't get any more. Okay? But the community continues to grow. Yes. Yes. You know? St. Thomas, on the other hand, chose the path of largely unrestricted development from the outset of its American journey in 1917. In the face of rapidly expanding commercial development in St. Thomas's historic port city, in 1968, the National Park Service spearheaded an initiative to set aside a significant portion of Charlotte as a special historic district. That's what it was called at that time. This district was later expanded and better defined as having two components. The Charlotte Historic and Architectural Control District, which is the area noted in blue on the map, basically a downtown and waterfront, and the Charlotte National Register District, all the way out almost over to the western side. Both of these districts are strictly regulated and controlled under federal and territorial laws. The National Register guidelines dictate what we can and can't do and regulate within both districts. But the regulations are a little firmer in the Architectural Control District that needs more context than it is in the broader district. Okay. But we have to follow both federal guidelines when we oversee these districts, and we have our own territorial laws that apply. It's pretty complicated. While few in the St. Thomas community argue the historical and cultural significance of Charlotte, Charlotte's downtown districts, there has long remained debate as to the level of restrictive regulations required, the historic and or cultural values of specific sites and structures, and the focus of interpretive narratives throughout its many neighborhoods. As we know, the town is broken into quarters. Kings Quarter, Prince Quarter, Crown Prince Quarter, Kings Quarter, Queens Quarter, Crown Prince Quarter. These opposing viewpoints have led to ongoing resistance to enforcement of preservation laws and generally diluted public support for preservation initiatives. A situation made even more difficult by an ongoing influx of non-Virgin Islanders with no background in the territory and often divergent economic goals and expectations and cultural perspectives. In the end, balancing the needs of an active urban community with the imposed constraints of mandated preservation has proven problematic. Today, St. Thomas's historic districts suffer from a lack of popular support, resulting in such issues as displacement, people leaving, okay, resistance to gentrification, demolition by neglect, a big one, and the institutional marginalization of preservation regulatory bodies. Entities like the Historic Preservation Commission struggle for support and funding. The Historic Preservation Commission is basically totally unfunded by government. Okay. Each year the commission submits a budget, and it's a pretty bare bones budget that runs around a little over $300,000, $400,000 a year. We figured that's what it would take to really run it effectively and manage it. So far, nothing.
Isn't the more fundamental issue that you have no enforcement powers?
Well, within that
need
budget,
money. You need money to enforce.
We need money. Luckily, we have very helpful and cooperative individuals in government, such as Administrator Schulten, who support us and offer us support when it comes to enforcement and so on. But we can enforce, but we can't really prosecute without, people in justice. And we don't have that representation at the moment either. But this may be talking out of school a little bit and a little too much information.
You were talking about the gentrification in downtown and non-Virgin owners come in. But for years, that's been a merchant area.
I know, it was the gentrified area of town.
Pardon?
It was the gentrified area of town.
And the buildings were built not by Virgin Islanders, but by the merchants.
Yeah.
And they came from all walks of life, I think, in the 1800s.
Yeah. Well, and that's why it's a little easier for us to contextualize the architectural control district. has a very discrete definition, historical definition to the context. It gets a little foggier when you get into all those neighborhoods that have grown and expanded and changed over the years. But these are part of our conundrums. These are the conundrums. We are here to talk about this because these are unresolved problems that are not easy issues to even talk about or wrap your head around.
Because I mean, just the thought that's been going through my mind for days is all these little houses, and one that even I looked at that may not be available by road. And everyone's so used to having cars. So who are they going to get to restore a house and live in it if they're...
You know what happens? Because those buildings and those neighborhoods are historically protected and regulated, and we can't develop things in there, we can't really expand that infrastructure, it leads to displacement. People leave. And everybody sits around and goes, oh my God, what happened to our town? Where did it go? It used to be so vital. I'll tell you where it went. It went there. Okay? Now, I thought this was a wonderful way to lead into where our town went. These two photographs were posted, I believe they were both from the Trust's Facebook page over the last year or so. And there was some discussion with the Pizarro painting of just where that was. Well, I think when you put it up against a picture taken by Alan Reinhardt in 1936, there is no question where that picture is. Okay? Absolutely no question.
Sugar Estate.
That's Sugar Estate.
That's where the high school is. The hospital.
And what we see is Sugar Estate the way it looked in Camille Pizarro's time in 1856, okay? And what it looked like at the beginning of our development decades in the Virgin Islands in the 1930s, okay? I think one of the things that's most striking here, you know, is that both of those landscapes are man-made landscapes. There's no natural landscape here. When the Danes or the Dutch or whoever came first arrived in St. Thomas, the valley of Sugar Estate was not planted in sugarcane. Okay? Those fields were tilled, the water course was managed, the water source, which was a large pond that was filled in by the West Indian Company when they dredged the harbor, where all that fill is that you see in the picture there. These are engineered landscapes. Okay? They're both engineered landscapes. So, back to where the town went. There's your town. That's where all of the services and people that would have stayed in Charlotte had it not been made a preservation district, should, if it went through its natural growing state of urban renewal, where older neighborhoods that were getting run down were reshaped, basically bulldozed, and new apartment buildings were raised in their places, and parking lots were put in, and streets were fixed, and so on. And now we have abandoned schools and very built businesses that are screaming for where the people are. Well, this is where the town went. Right here, it went to Sugar Estate. This is a direct result of displacement from the town. And it's interesting that if you look at Sugar Estate here, you have a lower school, you have a high school, you have a hospital, you have an industrial section, you have ancillary health services, you have a gentrified upper scale neighborhood on the hill, you have a middle class neighborhood, you have a blue collar neighborhood, you have housing projects, okay? You have a nursing home, you have you've got a tourist site, you've got a hotel on the hill here, you have your little tramway over here for the tourists, you have your port.
Don't forget groceries.
Groceries, downtown gentrified waterfront for, where you can get Gucci and all that stuff, right?
You got everything.
If you were to cut and paste this image of Sugar Estate and transpose it out in the middle of the bush in Maine or someplace out in the States, everybody would recognize it as a city, as a town.
When was this picture taken?
That's new. That's right off the government GIS website.
So what about all these boats? They're placed there.
What about?
If you find it out, huh? Oh, okay, now I got it.
Yeah, Grand,
Yeah.
the cruise ship.
Yeah.
And you know what?
Yeah.
We also have historical resources in there. We've got the old Wyco, original Wyco headquarters building, and we've got the old Sugar Estate sugar factory and the ruins of the original great house and factory with the horse mill. Right there in the corner across from Wheatley Center. The Lockhart House. Where the boiling pots are. Did you look in there? There's your horse mills, right? What's that? Is that what it is?
It's the, well, it's the
I don't think anybody
Lockhart,
lives
it
there
was the
now.
Lockhart summer
It was
home.
Lockhart.
It's a vacation home.
Yeah, that house was built. There's a more modern house built on the foundations of the original State House, but everything in front of that, in that corner of Wheatley by the stoplight, is the sugar factory. And if you look in there, you can still see the horse mill and the mills.
You could have some relics down in the yards.
Yeah, that's the Lockhart.
So now we're going to transition a little bit and ask ourselves, just why has the issue of preservation become such a conundrum in the USVI? And as a historian, I believe that the primary roots of this problem can be traced to two broad underlying factors. First, our 20th century U.S. legacy of mandated development. And when I say mandated development, I feel as opposed to organic or naturally occurring development, which is directed by the natural needs of an expanding community. And we know we did that for economic development. It's forced, but it's because we needed economic development. The second underlying issue is the problem of translating cultural values in an ambiguous political environment, resulting in issues of identity, displacement, disenfranchisement, gentrification, and nationalism, or a lack thereof. And I quote translating cultural values because I lifted the term from a wonderful presentation that was written by William Chapman called Preservation of the Virgin Islands, Problems with Translating Cultural Values. I have some copies of further reading out here. I only have one copy of each article, but I invite you all who are interested to go look through those, and if you like, jot down the name and just Google them, because you can get them online. But they give you some in-depth further reading on some of these issues we're facing.
So far, it sounds like you're arguing against preservation.
Maybe,
So far,
but I'm not.
okay.
No. I'm not arguing against preservation.
Some sugar estate that developed.
Yeah, I think that we just have to understand that for every action there is not necessarily equal reaction. That when we preserve, we change the dynamic of something. And in the end, what we will get to is that, we have to get a handle on both sides of the issue. We can't just scream about preservation without realizing that the social impacts and so on that we have to deal with at the same time. And perhaps we can do better. We're getting at here. But I want to look at being a historian, I like to look at what are the historical roots of these two underlying issues that I feel drive the dynamic of us not having consensus and always ending up in a conundrum about preservation. And the first one is this: it's significant that in the widely circulated invitation for this event, Trust Executive Director Eric Miles states, "You already know how many local organizations are concerned with historic preservation and its seeming opposite, economic development." I got a little knee-jerk with that one. Are preservation and economic development mutually exclusive? Does preservation hinder economic development? I mean, we've already seen that decisions for for historic preservation on St. Thomas and St. John, in a way, were in order to spur economic development. Okay? So, well, not necessarily. Then why do so many people within both the public and private sectors of the USVI seem to feel that way? Because this is one of our big problems, is people have that impression that you can't have preservation if you're going to have development.
I think, just an aside, is that because we're a country of wanting everything the way we want it and having our individual rights, that nobody wants to be told how to deal with their property. And I think that's an underlying issue as well.
I think that's going to be addressed here.
Oh, okay. We're on the
I
same
sort of
page.
disagree with that a little bit.
Yeah, let's
Yeah, I guess we have to
okay?
get to that part.
Because this is our problem. I mean, this is our problem. Yeah? We need to find some consensus. We need to work together. Herein lies a conundrum. And if we're looking for a whipping boy, maybe it all started with this guy. Okay. This is Governor James H. Oliver, our first United States governor. In analyzing how the situation has come to pass, it is necessary to look back and assess the merits of key policies that were set in place at the very outset of United States jurisdiction over the Virgin Islands in 1917. It must be understood that economic conditions in the newly acquired American territory were rather poor, with basic services and infrastructure, healthcare, sanitation, education, roads, port facilities, etc., in a very sorry state. Clearly, by U.S. standards, the situation was dire and called for decisive action. As set forth in a list of recommendations submitted by the Virgin Islands' first U.S. governor, Rear Admiral James H. Oliver, paramount among the areas of critical need for reform was the island's tax system, which in Oliver's words left much to be desired. Governor Oliver's primary complaint was that the existing tax structure served to discourage enterprise and suppress the production of much-needed government revenue by encouraging the holding of undeveloped land and vacant properties. Under the Danish colonial tax system, occupied buildings were taxed by their square footage, while agricultural land was taxed by the amount of acreage under cultivation. But there was no tax at all on undeveloped land, vacant homes, or unutilized commercial buildings, which, at the time of transfer, made up a majority of the territory's private landholders. Okay. So, I think at this point, let's go back in time and just take a little tour quickly around St. Thomas and see what St. Thomas looked like at the time of transfer. That's my time machine. So here we have Sugar Estate again, okay? And of course, we are looking into the most vital revenue-producing area of the islands at the time, our harbor. But of course, the harbor is really a shadow of its former self. If you had seen this picture 20 years previously, there'd be hundreds of ships in the harbor at one time. You know, all negotiating trade, and picking up passengers and transporting people and goods. Very active place. I also see a lot of grazing land, but I don't see many cattle. What we do see is the late Danish period development of the West Indian Company, which was started in 1913. They were responsible for all that filling and dredging and building the port. But what's interesting to note is that this picture was probably taken within a month or so before the 1916 hurricane, which did severe damage to that infrastructure. Blew down the cranes, you know, popped open the storage tanks, and basically put them back to square one. So the actual conditions of the town and the landscape shown in this picture were even worse 1 year later at the time of transfer.
Was that Hurricane Oliver?
Well, we should name it that. Okay, everybody recognize this building in Chapel?
Is it St. John?
No.
Tutu.
This is Tutu Park Mall, guys.
Yes, yes.
Yep. We can see Parent Health background.
Right.
We can see the dairy over here. Okay. And this is the Anna Retreat Estate House. Jim Tillett's and the factory, the sugar factory buildings associated with this estate, where Jim Tillett's compound is, which is down to the right.
That burned in the was
Yeah, and I was ashamed to lose that because that house was actually in pretty good shape, or restorable anyway. And certainly most of our north side, basically from about Drake Sea. This would be Canaan here, Mahogany Run down in here. Not much on the landscape, not much tax revenue there, huh? Hawk Hill and Solberg, looking out west. Mosquito Bay. Moorfield.
Where's that?
It's the airport.
Moorfield. Oh, the airport.
What year was this? Picture.
It was 1916. And this is the old Mosquito Bay estate compound. There's a sugar factory, and the sugar factory is an estate house there. And this is the Cabritburg estate house, which was a separate estate.
Where is Mosquito Bay in there? I mean, where is that what
This
they
is
call
Lindbergh,
that?
this is Lindbergh Bay.
Lindbergh.
Oh, that's what they call Mosquito Bay?
Yes.
Is Lindbergh Bay.
Yes.
They renamed it to Lindbergh?
They renamed it to Lindbergh after Lindbergh Land.
Uh-huh.
But all this has been filled in for the airport. And Brewers Bay just there. Yeah. And here we have, I think this is going to be Canton. Or maybe this is Canton. Yeah, that's Canton Prairie House and the sugar factory there. And this is Niski, right? Palm Bay, Lindbergh Bay again there.
Would that be the church you see there? That would be
Yep,
the church.
that's Niski right
So that's Water Island?
That's Water Island. Yep.
And that's Gregory or Cromberg.
And the food is taken from
Yeah.
which position?
I'm sorry?
The food is taken from which area? You think?
Oh,
Up around where the road that crosses between Crown Mountain and
oh,
That's
Scott, Scott Free?
Scott Free.
Yeah, I think about Scott Free.
What is that development in Crum Bay? Is that a catchment?
Where, here?
Further back behind Niski, in the next bay, Crum Bay, where Wappa is now.
That's,
Right
yeah,
there.
that's Santo.
Right.
Looks like a catchment.
No catchments in this period.
Right, that was Navy, right?
No, that's pasture.
Yeah, so,
That's probably go pasture.
yeah, you're right, that Monsanto.
Yeah, let's go pasture.
Yes, but I've been some up around from, because that's the road, what's it called?
They have like looking down, waters.
So, anyway, at Transfer, in response to Oliver's recommendations, U.S. policymakers quickly focused on the island's vast tracts, as we just seen, of untaxed private land holdings as an almost limitless reserve of potential government revenue. As a result, the territory's previously unexploited wealth of natural, as well as cultural and historical, because remember, cultural landscapes, and there are historical sites in every one of those pictures. Okay? Reserve became the primary fuel for economic growth that eventually propelled the Virgin Islands into the period of unprecedented prosperity and progress that we now refer to as the development decades. Development decades really started to kick off in the mid-1930s, but World War II kind of put the kibosh on it. And then it picked up again after the war with increasing momentum.
But David,
Yeah.
it had to be taxed or assessed on the basis of market value. And the market value at the time was down to practically nothing.
So here's what they did to counteract that, okay? This reliance upon tax-driven model for economic and bureaucratic growth, and remember, government grew along with the developmental growth, okay, economic growth. We also grew our government at the same time, which needed more money to sustain it. Was reinforced in 1954 by a clause in the revised Organic Act that limited the VI government's ability to float bonds and or borrow needed monies to no more than 10% of its aggregated assessed valuation of taxable real estate. Okay? This law effectively legislated that whenever the government of the Virgin Islands wanted to borrow additional funds, which it quickly developed the habit of doing, it simply had to raise property tax assessments in order to elevate its debt ceiling, thereby forcing struggling private sector landowners to liquidate their land holdings and incentivizing speculators and developers that purchase those properties to convert them into ever-increasing numbers of high-density, revenue-generating, i.e. taxable, units we call subdivisions.
I don't agree.
Okay? A process that has transformed much of our once rural cultural landscape into urban and suburban sprawl, bringing along with it all of the social economic hardships inherent with urbanization and mass displacement. You know, Amory,
You mean to
I'll
say
be glad
that,
to argue this with you. As I stated from the beginning, this was my personal opinion. So, yeah. So I'm not.
you mean to say that people like Lindquist, or like Bosholta, like Hartman, etc., that those poor people were pushed into selling their property because they were starving or something? They kept their property for a long, long time.
Not,
And they-
because
and
obviously there were always
Even
the
the
wealthier
Christians.
element, you know, that managed to hold on to large tracts of property.
You
But
ever
they
spoke
also,
to
they
Wilma
also,
Marsh? Did
they-
you ever speak to her?
yes. This is not an argument, Avery. This is pointing out problems, you know?
I do have a question of this period, David.
Yeah.
And it kind of stems from his perspective there. Wasn't there a large auction of land at that point? And those same names, Lockhart, Bosholta, and Hartman, had a strategy that, dealt with that auction. Did that happen at this time around this whole tax thing?
I can't answer you or get into the micro histories of this. I'm painting with a large brush here.
Okay, well, I was just wondering about land sale versus tax, because I heard this.
What it boils down to, though, and there are still, and always have been, agricultural exemptions, okay? There's been homestead exemptions. There's been all kinds of strategies that have allowed people of means and resources to retain. We will always have a landed elite, okay?
Land patents.
But that's diminishing. Remember, we are only in the process of history. It hasn't worked itself all the way out yet. And when you look at the large tracts of land that existed on the islands when we were younger, right? And see how many small little revenue-generating units that has been broken down into, it's staggering. Now, if you project that trend into the future, what are we going to have left? And we are going to end up in a situation with only that old landed elite who have the wherewithal to negotiate the system and hold on to tracts of land, holding them. But we already see, I mean, just this last year, a large tract of sorghum-free was given over to the University of the Virgin Islands. That's just a strategy for keeping land, you know? That's a strategy that's because the burden, the tax burden, is forcing people to figure out different strategies. Most people, most common people, sell to developers, or if they have the wherewithal, subdivide themselves. And the Virgin Islands government is in the same business. Virgin Islands government land, as we see, right up the hill here, is being subdivided. Taxable units, okay? This is the trend. This is what it's all about. And yes, Amory's correct. There always has been a landed elite. There remains a landed elite, okay? But even their properties are diminishing. History is only in the process of acting
It's
itself.
slowing it down. I mean, Old Man Hartman, for example, his role is,
You know,
please,
God bless the people who are tenacious and hang on to their land. That's all I can say there.
As of this year, they're all being taxed out of their land. If you've gotten your property tax bill, John?
There it is. You know?
I was saying no for that.
This is an ongoing process.
Just as an example, in the 40s, my dad was here, came here, my mom was born here, they got married. Right after the war, everything was for sale. He was buying up stuff like crazy. And he and his friend bought tons of land all over Canton. And it gradually got subdivided off and split between the two of them. And there's hardly anything left now.
In short, from my perspective, okay, what this all boils down to is that we have effectively institutionalized a pattern of forced economic growth and development that is inevitably proven to be unsustainable, because you can only cut up your remaining land into just so many small pieces. Okay? It may not be unsustainable now. I mean, you know, there's a lot of people in government and in the private sector that would like you to think that we should just keep on developing, keep on doing what we're doing. I happen to think that maybe we need to reconsider that. Okay? But I'm not anti-development.
They don't make more land, do they?
They don't make more land. So this system, this path we've gone is largely unsustainable by today's more enlightened global perspectives. And now we have to get into a dynamic that maybe we're not all fully recognizing and realizing that's going on in the world right now, is globalization. And because of globalization, perspectives of people and populations are changing. And, you know, little micro issues like our conundrums here are getting lost in the bigger global problems that all of our young people are facing. They're not growing up in an age where we write letters and talk to each other and sit down at the family table and discuss the issues, or go to our church groups, or have debate in communities, you know. They go on the internet. They go on the TV. We go on the internet. We go on the TV. And we are bombarded by the bigger global issues. And that constant expanding and having to set our thought patterns to much more inclusive global thought patterns is making it hard to deal with small issues, particularly microcultural issues and so on. Okay? So I think a significant trend I see is that by today's more enlightened global perspective, this failed economic strategy, just developing and developing and developing, might be seen as reflective of old world colonialist tendencies that perpetuate gentrification and the elevation of an elite money ruling class with little regard for issues such as social displacement or the preservation of natural, historical, or cultural resources.
Well, I don't necessarily think that's a new thing.
No, it's not a new thing, but I think that more and more people have to come to terms with it.
I think social displacement came as a way to reach greater comfort. And it was strictly voluntary on the part of a lot of people who lived in town and who didn't appreciate their cramped up
Yeah.
situation with
I agree.
poor
I agree
utilities.
100%, but it's a result.
Strictly voluntary. A lot of,
Strictly voluntary.
there was areas
No, it's
in
not
the neighborhoods in Savon, in Polyberg and so forth, that it was not strictly voluntary. They were told that they had to leave and that they could relocate to Tutu. They could relocate to other areas of the island, but they had to move from here.
In order to do what?
Because there was, they said sanitation issues, they said all kinds of things, but these were properties that were owned by those individuals. So it was not voluntary.
There's, I was just at the First Giants Literary Festival this last weekend, and there was a panel on historic preservation. Betsy Resende was talking about some of the research she's doing on the water pen area. Same situation. You know, people based not voluntary displacement whatsoever. Nothing that we thought.
Oh, and services leave. You know, that to me has been the biggest impact in our town. Is that services?
Yeah,
service. You know, no more groceries within walking. You know, no doctor's office within walking. Pharmacies, no pharmacies anymore.
No parking.
But you're forgetting the whole thing. You are expecting, people are expecting that this little dot in the Atlantic Ocean, which are compared to an island in Denmark, that we are going to be able to support all these births, all these children that graduate. That is not possible. My husband grew up on an island Moon that was the size of St. Croix. And the young people there knew that if they couldn't take over the family business, they had to move away. They had to go away. Because that island could no way, they didn't have factories or anything, or were not going to have it. They had a lot of tourism. The island could not feed them. But we are demanding and telling the young people, oh, you're going to get a job. Go out there, educate, come back and get a job. We have nothing else to offer than tourism. And if you keep developing and developing, you're losing that. That's all we got. That's for people to come and see a beautiful island and not hotels.
Yeah. And here to me is the ugly truth.
Oh.
Is over the last half century, our primary industry in the USVI hasn't been tourism.
Okay.
It's been development. Development is
Uncontrolled development.
uncontrolled, unregulated development, largely. And how does that relate to our preservation conundrum? Well, proponents of development generally feel threatened by preservationists, preservation policies, and preservation movements.
Generally.
Generally. Yeah. You
Well,
know,
David, and back to your original point.
The governor should be here.
Development is a good thing for preservation and vice versa.
it can be. It can be.
And this is what we are missing here.
No, we're not missing
If
it.
it's not
Well,
blind
not
development.
we in this room maybe, but,
Yeah.
On the island.
If
Yeah,
it's
you're
not
right.
blind development.
100%. And that.
and
that's-
it's all for the Caribbean.
And that's why we
It's
need
not
to do
just
it.
here.
Yes, you're 100% right.
We
It's
need
not just
hotel
the Caribbean.
inventory, we need hotel inventory built in a responsible way.
Right.
Responsible tourism is what we need to be chasing.
Perhaps we have finally reached a point where it is time to reconsider our future path and embrace the fact that our land and long neglected historical and cultural natural resources represent valuable economic assets. Okay? With proper care and stewardship, these resources can help propel our islands into a new era of sustainable, low-impact, eco-friendly development and socioeconomic stability. I believe that. Okay? And the best part is that we don't need a revolution. We don't need to dismantle our system or reinvent ourselves to do this. We don't need to become someone else. We simply need to revise our ways of thinking and redirect our energies and add a healthy dose of social consciousness into our development process.
And part of the problem is greed that gets in the way.
That's right there. You know? I believe it is possible to make preservation, restoration, revitalization, replenishment, conservation, stewardship, and adaptive reuse vital and productive revenue-generating growth industries throughout our territory. We could have a restoration industry. We could have a preservation industry. We could put people to work, stewardship, conservation, adaptive reuse. We could revitalize our town.
They're actually
No
finding
problem.
out that adaptive reuse is cheaper than demolition and
construction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In many
What
cases.
did that? What was that? We
Can
didn't
you
hear
step
that.
in and say that
Oh,
again?
sorry. Yeah, they're actually finding out now that adaptive reuse is cheaper than demolition and construction.
Yeah, and as our construction costs continue to go up in the territory, utilizing and recycling materials in existing structures makes a lot of sense. So I believe it's the future. I really do. And who better to lead a new age renaissance in the islands than our worldly and educated VI youth? Because, you know, I go into schools, I talk to young people, I am just amazed at how worldly, the level of thought and intelligence that we produce here in Virgin Islands. You know? Our young people, it is a shame, okay, that so many leave and don't feel they have a place here, okay? So who better to lead this renaissance than our worldly and educated VI youth, who instead of feeling disenfranchised and displaced and fleeing the territory, will stay or return to be part of a positive, productive future for the Virgin Islands and Virgin Islanders. Just my wish.
David, I think it's a question of respecting what our elders or ancestors built and trying to find a way to adapt it to modern usage.
So I think you're talking about translating cultural values. Isn't that amazing?
Well, as a person who restored or resuscitated, I should say, a 200-year-old house, I think that my rule was to put things in and make it look as though it had been there all the time. That's my rule.
And you have a beautiful home, and you did a wonderful job. And I'll have to say that Virgin Islanders like yourself are not our problem. Are not our problem.
And we don't have the
But that's,
we need more of you guys. All right. So let's move on. We're getting a little long, and I have one concluding.
So I'm supposed to stand corrected that we can indeed, through development, keep all the young people here?
Not necessarily.
No, not necessarily.
Oh, okay.
But I
Well,
think
that's
that
what
I think that to some degree we can make the economy and our islands more conducive for them staying and being part of it. If we can change our mindset and demonstrate to our youth that we are concerned about their future and our island's future.
Architecture and construction is a huge cultural component of the Virgin Island society.
And you made a really good
there
living.
are lots and lots of young people that are in that particular field that like this kind of thing.
But
And
are they indeed interested in
Oh, yeah, they are.
also the culture they are?
It's you create
Very much so.
the environment, you know?
Okay.
It's a building they will come
I'm
to.
glad to hear that.
And again, guys, this is me, my opinions, and I'm painting with a wide brush, not getting into the details. But I think, that issue of kind of forced development, economic development, when I think about that issue of forced economic development, I equate it to like using chemical fertilizers to make things grow, Eventually, you spread enough chemical fertilizer on a piece of property and you're going to make it sterile. And it won't grow anything anymore.
Sir Anderson?
where if we use organic, we spread it with fertilizer and mulch, and we can sustain, we can make things sustain. So that's the way I look at development. It's not a matter of not developing, it's developing responsibly in a sustainable way.
We need to change our ideology and understanding that people come from all around the world to the territory to get our understanding of our history and our heritage and culture. But yet, we build a big building with air conditioning on top of the beach, which is ruining all of that, so that they can stay in it. Perhaps they need to just stay in a house that has been made into a bed and breakfast.
I mean, are you guys, we could cut this off here.
No.
There's not too much more, but this second issue that I think is really one of our root problems is a little more complicated, maybe a little more contentious. And again, I'll point out, these are just my personal perspectives. Okay? And I looked at things more from a historical standpoint. The problem of translating cultural values in an ambiguous political environment. And again, I have another definition for you. Ambiguous, unclear, inexact, because a choice between alternatives has not been made. Of course, here we have transfer, we have Danish flag on one side, American flag on the other, and stuck in between is somebody hiding behind a Virgin Islands flag.
Which is a beautiful flag.
Who is it?
Which, of course, is a matter of perspective.
Everyone has an opinion.
We could get into iconography.
Maybe there should be a chicken hawk.
The kids think it's a banana quid. That is our national bird, right? Now, I think that, just again, from a historical perspective, I think it's interesting when we look at the Virgin Islands historically, the Danish West Indies. Historically, the people of the Danish West Indies and later the Virgin Islands of the United States have always been a rather cosmopolitan group. This is largely due to the historical legacy of mobility. We were a port. People came and left through here all the time. Even someone growing up in the port, even a poor person growing up in the port, was exposed to all kinds of worldly ideas and thought and goods and so on. Okay? This is largely due to their historical exhibit on mobility, and also the fact that we were generally a poor place, and when we came after the period of imposed servitude, bondage, slavery, whatever you want to call it, when people had to go out and make a living, people migrated to go make a living. People went down to Macaris to cut cane. They went to the Panama Canal to work on the canal. They went to the United States and worked as maids and housekeepers and chefs or got education.
Military.
Served in the military. Served in the military later, once they could, yeah. So, this has made us a very mobile and cosmopolitan people by nature, okay? And it's also part of our geographical positioning where we were right in a spot because of, largely because of the political status and policies of Denmark, being a free port and being a place that was open and accepting of migrants from different places, stayed neutral in most of the wars, many of the wars. We've become a place where people migrate to and through, okay? And I think it's interesting, this comes from a little booklet I did on the 1680 census of the Danish West Indies. And I did some demographic breakdowns, and it was just interesting to see the demographics of St. Thomas in 1680. This was the population. And look at the list of where people declared they were born, Statia, St. Kitts, St. Martin, Tortola, I can't read them all, Curacao, Antigua, Martinique, Montserrat, Guadeloupe, all over the Caribbean. People came from all over the West Indies. And we also had people from Brazil, we had people from the United States, we had people from Europe. So we've always been this melange of humanity. And indeed, today's United States Virgin Islands can still rightfully be regarded as a nation of immigrants. E pluribus unum, which is the American United States slogan, and also the slogan of Jamaica, out of many, one. Yet within this outwardly appearing one lurks a long history of resistance to assimilation and no shortage of differing and widely divergent viewpoints, often divided down racial, ethnic, social, religious, economic, and political lines. Perhaps this tendency of non-assimilation is due to the Virgin Islands having historically always been a colony and never having experienced a unifying moment of self-determined nationalism. There are no popular revolutionary movements in our history, although there is no lacking of social upheaval and political realignments. One of the wonderful things about Virgin Islanders is we love to argue, but in the end we always get along, you know?
I think
everybody's got a viewpoint.
I think the greatest problem is the one of transiency. I think that is the core of the matter as far as I'm concerned, is that nobody puts in real roots. Yes,
exactly.
Or hardly anybody. And they're here for a time and then they go.
Within those, definitions.
Yeah, and that's where a lack, and now, I am not arguing for independence, okay? But that's where a lack of nationalism or national identity hinders us, okay? And that's what this is really saying, okay? Because, like all of our important social and political problems in the USVI, preservation is not a simple or singular issue. There are, in fact, so many complex factors that affect the dynamics of preservation that they are hindering our ability to develop and implement coherent preservation management strategies and policies throughout the territory. Paramount among these complicating factors is the fundamental lack of a foundational common narrative. Ask ourselves.
But you hear that in discussion. People say, in Anguilla we did this, in Tortola we did that, and
who are we?
Antigua.
Because in order to have that identity, in order to have cohesive policy and agreement, you have to have agreement of who the heck are we? Where did we come from? Where do we want to go from here? And what do we preserve to tell the history of our journey? When everybody's got a different history and a different journey, you can't ask them what to preserve. The people who've just arrived don't have any background on our place. They don't care if we lick down the fort,
Well, we don't have any signs. We don't have any signs or tell the story. I mean, there's people living in Long Path that don't know the significance of some of those structures that right next door to them. We don't even have a sign that says, enjoy our historic district. You're entering a historic town.
Great reason to fund the Historic Preservation Commission, because one of their mandates is to make signs. You can't make them without one. So herein lies our big conundrum. And within that conundrum, are multiple conundrums.
So we are like in the old days when they traveled west, we are like a depot where people get for a while stay and then they move on.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
We're like a Home Depot now.
Yeah. For transients. I'm finishing up here, so let's get to the end of it.
So we use that.
Most of us who live here respect the fact that there are many histories and historical perspectives. But preservation laws laid out in rules, regulations, and guidelines drafted by the U.S. Department of Interior, National Park Service, the entity that directs and oversees federal preservation policy in the U.S. Virgin Islands, do not always reflect the level of cultural diversity or sense of broad inclusiveness of ideas necessary to be relevant in what is, in effect, a unique, unassimilated overseas territory, aka a colony. Okay. This is one of our problems. We are trying to fit rules and regulations that regulate our historic issues and districts. We're trying to use a package, a set of rules prepared by a place that doesn't have an identity. I mean, you could argue the United States has an identity problem like any place else, but you go to school and study American history in America, there is a cohesive narrative, okay? People emigrate to the Virgin Islands, or to the United States, and their tendency is to some degree, assimilate. We have a history of people migrating to here, becoming part of the community, but retaining their cultural identities and values. So how can we run historic preservation programs or agree on what is important to preserve and what to let go or what to do with it if we don't have a common understanding and narrative? Okay? Okay. In order to have that, you need a sense of unified nationalism. But you can't do that as a colony. Okay? It's as simple as that. It can't happen as a colony. No colony has ever done it. Okay? And we're one of the last colonies in the planet.
Old San Juan has done a magnificent job. Maybe you don't call Puerto Rico a colony, but I do.
Yeah, their status issue is a little different than ours. Okay? They also were given citizenship over 100 years ago. You know, they were given citizenship at the time they were annexed. Okay? It's a whole different issue, and it's a bigger place. But to some degree, they suffer from the same problems. But they have a cultural unity because they're a Latin American entity. Language and culture unifies them. They have a sense of identity. You ask a Puerto Rican who they are, they know who they are. Yeah.
But you don't hear people saying, I'm a Virgin Islander or a Saint-Tomian. They say it, but it's not,
well, everybody's territory-wide. Well, I'm a Saint-Tomian, and somebody's going, no, you're not. You know,
yeah.
I'm a Saint-Tomian. You're not a Saint-Tomian.
Right.
You know?
The native Virgin
well, then I'm a Virgin Islander.
Small.
You think so?
Well, they become the minority.
And what the heck is a Saint-Tonian? I wish Lana and Albert were here.
And they can't even agree what a native Virgin Islander is.
Okay.
What's a native Virgin Islander?
Yeah. So, you know, we have this structure that doesn't always reflect our diversity and cultural values. And neither do the interpretations and narratives generated by these entities fully mesh with the popularly held perspectives within the territory. I mean, I read all the time stuff generated by Preservation Magazine and so on. I say, wow, that's great. It works in America, but it ain't relevant. Okay. A poignant illustration of this was posted on the blog of a young native Virgin Islander on Thursday of this week. And I think it really highlights our diversity. Hadia Sur, who is a St. Jonian, very well educated. She has her master's.
She's getting her PhD right now.
She's working on a PhD in Brown right now. A very bright woman. And she wrote, visitors flock to our shores to see these sugar mills, and they want to hike, have picnics, and host weddings in the shadows of our sites of bondage. How do we grapple with the symbolic and material implications of using sites of trauma as props? We are not merely speaking of a historical period that has passed. The appropriation of these spaces as vehicles for tourism is also symbolic of ongoing forms of dispossession. Predominantly white visitors are able to experience moments of leisure and bliss, snap selfies in front of the sugar mills, and leave, while the predominantly black, brown, and white Creole population struggles to achieve equality, adequate education systems, and economic stability.
That's your problem. That's a person that feels that way. When is it going to go away?
That's a young person wants to be
Yeah, but I mean-
revolutionary. We all were at that age.
But it's
If you weren't like that, there's something wrong
But
with
there's
you.
truth in what
What you need
Jeanette's
to
saying.
see is that this is through the eyes of someone
I know
who is
that.
struggling that reality.
Yeah, I know that, but then this person is obviously not happy about
Do they do weddings and?
tourists coming here.
No,
Yeah.
no, she's just,
I think it's a comment that's really interesting because you wouldn't see people going and doing weddings in front of Dash Tower. Or
yeah, they are. They do it, taking selfies. for
They
Japanese.
do?
Big time.
Weddings?
No, no.
Oh, man.
They're taking selfies.
I don't know about weddings.
When you talk about
People go there.
What a great place to go.
Guys, let me wrap this up. I got 2 more slides. Then we
This is
can,
all the Conundrum.
then we can lapse into melee, okay? So in conclusion, is it even possible for preservation advocates to find support and gain traction in the face of such an overwhelming diversity of popular perspectives?
Yes.
Maybe eventually. But, in my opinion, what we need first is honest dialogue and some diligent consensus building. And that's why we're here. And that's why I hope this series will continue to explore these. And just as a parting reminder, I have a little motto that I use because I'm a sentimental guy. I mean, I think about my early childhood memories on St. John's Lawn. You know, it's amazing. There was a lot of blows. You know, it wasn't really easy, emotionally or physically. You know? But looking back on it now, I just remember the beauty of it. You know, the people like Herbert Samuels, Mildred Hodge, and Mr. Ritchie, you know, that informed me and guided me through this. But I always have to check myself that we need to be aware of nostalgia as a reason for preservation of doing things. Okay? And every once in a while we have to be reminded that the development we've experienced has taken us beyond certain aspects, certain realities of our history that were not all that great. You know, not all that good, you know. And you question, was it really the good old days?
Yeah, good question.
Maybe it's good that humans kind of filter the bad and remember the good. Okay. But we have to remind ourselves, these pictures are not that old. Rural households throughout the territory still look like those households at the time when I was a kid. Downtown Market Square was often filthy. Parts of our waterfront and down the open guts coming through town and squalor of the French town area.
Soil.
I remember as a kid just like, you know, you hold your nose going through town. And in the middle there is an article from the 1953 Daily News that I found that lists the businesses on Main Street, most of them taverns and restaurants, that had no sanitation facilities whatsoever. That the refuse was still going into the open gutters down into the heart.
That's
1953. Yeah. So, I don't mean to end on a downer note, but it isn't really. Because what it reminds us is that we can make a better place for ourselves. We just got to do it more conscientiously in the future. So, that's it.
Great job, David. Awesome.
Wonderful.
Great job.
No, this is, I'm out. This is it.
Oh,
You
this
guys,
is only
you guys
for
take it
an hour.
from here.
No, there will be many,
Many times. Not to stay with other students.
no, this is the very first we're hoping to have at least 7 more series of this. Perhaps we can persuade David to come back and mediate a panel discussion, something of that.
We have not exhausted him completely.
We have for now, but we can always twist his arm. So thank you very much. I would like to ask, open it to the floor, in summation, what do you think we learned? Anything today? What? Doreen?
Well, I guess what I'm coming away with, something that I guess I always believe in, is there's positive and negatives to everything. So yes, we're a colony, and yes, we're immigrants, and yes, there's a lot of people that weren't born here, and there's a lot of people that were born here. So yeah, we're different than maybe another town in the States, but the same differences, the same things that cause problems can also help us to solve them. So who we are is we're a bunch of different people. That's who we are. So we go with it.
Excellent. Because this is why we're doing this series, is to hear from people.
You see, I'm a historic preservationist. I've been one forever. I was born in a town that got started 1,300 years ago. So the feeling of a historic district, the scale of the symmetry of the windows, the color of the brick, the size of the streets, the bar around the corner, for me, it's all quality of life. I appreciate the architecture. I appreciate the texture, the sun, the colors. I don't care. I mean, the culture, the people, they're wonderful people all over the world. There are historic districts all over the world. I've been to many of them. I've worked in one. Similar things that David was saying about the sewage in the harbor happened to this town that I lived in, where the river was through logging. When my wife grew up in that river, that place stunk. The kids wouldn't go there, right next to high school. Now they have historic districts. This is a fashionable thing. This is a quality of life. There are people like him, like him, like him, like me. We live downtown. We like it there because of the way it is. Now those guys have been there forever. Families have had the properties, and you know, this is part of their cult, their blood. This is their home, you know. But a lot of people will just live there because of the way it looks like. And in my 23 years in that same hill, like the first couple of weeks that I got there, you came to my house. Remember that? And no, Ms. Johansen came to my house and showed me a trick or two about landscaping and things that I didn't know about. There were trees, stuff, new stuff that I didn't know about. And since I've been there, that district, from one end to the other, has been hugely improved. Preservation with the people that I've worked with, known, and it's incredible, the community that exists. Lots of young people, architects, engineers, entrepreneurs, on and on and on. The community is amazingly vibrant. What I'm smelling now, you know, and that has nothing to do with administrations. We tried to get the last administration. I've been trying the same thing. I'm a one-trick pony. I did it in Maine. This is what I've been, that's all I ever do, you know. And there is a, what do you call it? Something has happened here the last year. Something is happening lately that is better than I've ever seen it. More buildings. Everybody's paying attention. That economic development thing is like amazing. You know, scrape and paint and on and on and on. I just see it happening more and more. And I'm not concerned about, this is the unity. The people in the neighborhood that want that, the jazz people once a week, you know, once a month, the events people, everybody's attacking it, and it hasn't been attacked like this before. Am I right or am I wrong? Do you see the same thing?
I'd like to really thank the organization for the invitation to the Caribbean Genealogy Library. As a board member of that organization, I heard about this and I said that I needed to be here because I needed to understand the thoughts and where, and you're not representing the organization, so I won't say that, what David's thoughts are on preservation. My other hat is as an economic developer. And I happen to work in a very unique area of the Economic Development Authority, which is community development. And so we look at economic development in a little different way. We have worked within the neighborhoods, and not in the main town, but in the neighborhoods, to look at how to move forward economic development in a positive way, starting with what our historic understanding of that particular community is. And so they start the first night, and we had charrettes, they started the first night with their history. And it was a discussion with regard to each community and what their thoughts are on the good parts of their history and their historic understanding of themselves, and what parts they wanted to take forward into the next generation and in generations to come. And so I think that that is where we've seen a lot of positive forward moving. So yes, we have conundrums that still exist, but I feel a lot more positive about where we're moving once you really sit down and look at the plans that people have developed for their communities that really take into consideration the history, the heritage, the culture of those communities. I think one of the things that we are challenged by is that we as a collective community are not aware of the individual histories of those communities. Once we take our understanding of that, I think then we can all assimilate into one understanding of ourselves.
But what I wonder about is when the young people, the garbage they're around. I walk, we live in Heavenside, and I walk under the below, it's called, with estate. I guess it's no, it's on a private road. There are corrugated from either Maryland or Hugo lying there, big fat cables. This island has never been and will never be cleaned up, so we can see more of the beauty of this island.
We are, the government is the people. We need to get up and go take it up.
I mean, what is the fright, the young people? Why don't they consider this? I never hear a young person being upset about this. And every morning I go out and I pick up body.
I think they're upset, but you're the one, and I have to represent the young people, because the young people came into these meetings that we held and were very vocal, extremely vocal. I think that if you're seeing it, perhaps they're not seeing it. And perhaps you need to step forward and say, you know what? No, you don't understand. When you're walking past, and the town and the neighborhoods that we see are what we saw when we were younger. And we tend to miss the actual reality of what it is now. So yes, you may see it. But as I drive by, I may not see it, because what I'm seeing is what I historically knew to be there. And you can say the same thing about Main Street as you walk down Main Street. When you go to Sea Trade, the cruise ship industry conference in Florida, they will tell you that yes, our town is historic, but it is in poor condition. Many Virgin Islanders, as they pass through every day and drive through our Main Street every day, they don't see the poor condition. They see what they are, the nostalgia. You're seeing the garbage, but those cords have been there from Hugo, from Maryland.
The old house is falling apart, but if there's garbage and corrugated and old cables floating around, if that's removed, it will look better.
So whose responsibility is it to remove it? Is it the landowner, or is that a government responsibility?
I believe, well, depending on what the zoning is there, if it is a private road, then it would be the landowner, yes. And they should have a fine for not cleaning up.
We're going to go to Stakeholder.
This is the conundrum. I mean, this is the whole thing. And it's a perfect word.
Conundrum.
And the conundrum is that we talk about it here among ourselves. This is the choir.
Yeah.
This is the choir. And this is what upsets me when I come to these things. We need to take it out. We need to take it, this is political. Everybody wants to hide from the political issues of the day. This is political. And the timing is right now.
I think so too.
You're 100 days in.
I think so too.
And now is the time to strike.
And that's why
And we need to take it out of a room this big and take it into a larger thing. Put it on the net. Put these presentations on there. And you can't be afraid to take your blows.
This will be, it will be, the future ones will be live streamed, but this will be posted.
Because this is the conundrum we're in.
But
this development thing is so important.
It's not solely political. You know, it's like David said. If you look at the places that successfully, you know, accomplished coming back from the brink, which we're kind of at the edge of that, it was with a public-private partnership. And it's not only political, and it's not only private. I mean, just, you know, for instance, right? We have an attitude here that, you know, we're always looking for some philanthropist to come save the day. We always looked outside. That's kind of almost a, you know, a pity of being an island in a way. And we think that philanthropy happens out of pity. And it doesn't. It happens out of some surplus cash and desire. But if you really want to get philanthropists involved, we have to make a presentation at their level, which is a multi-million-dollar level. It's not going to be the typical island acceptance, Sharpie marker, pop-up Kmart tent, and expect them to get excited about it. And that's one of the big problems. So yes, there is a political prong that needs to be addressed, but there's a private prong that needs to be addressed, and people need to be educated. People that are living in the neighborhoods need to be educated about the neighborhoods. You know, yes, there's a transient thing, there's an immigration thing, but you know, if it wasn't for the immigrant, from day one, nothing would have ever got done here. You know, and the Danes, even though they owned the island, they didn't really do things here. It was the other countries that were here and entrepreneurs and business people that actually drove things forward. So, you know, living in town, you know, I'd also have to, you know, say that the young people are the most angry in the islands. They do see things. The problem is that we have the lack of identity. We haven't crystallized anything for them. We have the whole world that comes here, but we don't get any exposure from that. You know, we're not communicating with the visitor. We're isolating ourselves or isolating them. And so the young kids don't get any exposure to anybody else. And, you know, try to leave St. Thomas. Everybody here knows it's $500 to pass go, you know, just to get off the island to an airport where you can actually go somewhere. You know, so it's pretty expensive. When you're a young kid, you're pretty much locked in.
But do you feel that other tourist areas that people get in touch with the local? I mean, that's what comes with tourists. They're just here for the day or for a week or whatever.
It depends on how it's done.
And they want to see the sights. I mean, if you go to Thailand or you go to South America or Hawaii or whatever, do you feel that the tourists there are getting more
I'm a different traveler, so you know, I'm not a tourist. You know, there's a difference between tourists and travelers.
There's different kinds of tourism.
Yeah,
right.
yeah, but he mentioned that the tourists come here, that they're not getting involved.
Could I just say something? You know, I think part of, you know, that we have to do things more responsibly and rethink things. Tourism is one of the things we need to rethink. Okay? And if we're going to continue it as a primary industry or a significant industry, we need to make the tourist experience authentic.
Amen.
Now, there's a big difference. If we are creating Disney World tourism, if we are building Jimmy Buffett villas, you know, and theme parks, we're not going to have interaction between the tourists and the community. But if we were the destination, if our authentic culture, who we were, the landmarks that we think are important, if we embrace them and make them our tourism product, then when people come, they will interact with the authentic place, and there would be more opportunities.
And the authentic person. And the authentic person.
Because then a tourist could stop and ask anybody on the street, hey, what's that beautiful building there?
And
I'll tell you what it is.
And it helps young people too, if we're having that discussion. It helps the formation of identity too, to have that kind of a tourism push. Because, you know, one of the contradictions within globalization right now, what we're facing, is that there's a contradiction. You have to have a strong sense of local identity to have any access to whatever the fruits of globalization might offer. Otherwise, you're just kind of in limbo. And I'm not going to say that, you know, that political dependence and tourism can't mesh together, but it, as we see around us, it has kind of exacerbated some problems within identity, within nationhood, all kinds of things that disenfranchise our young people when they go out and try to get whatever the fruits of globalization might be.
Well, one of the biggest strains in town is our food tropism and our focus. You know, that's a 8-hour-a-day prostitute that comes and visits us. You know, we don't even, you know, so we're doing things for the tourists instead of doing things for ourselves. You know, right, and we don't, right, exactly, right. We're not doing things for ourselves. You know, look, living in town and having grown up in town, I've seen a couple cycles of different, I've seen a lot of transients associated with even those hurricanes. And we need to improve the quality of life for, you know, businesses will happen, and if you show them this is the standard that we have. Another big problem in town is all of this is nice, historic preservation, and you know, I get in debates with the commission about this because I'm a big person on safety and security, is if we had this town policed, the economy of this town would just explode. But it's unsafe. You know, you made a comment about who's going to live up those steps and walk up those steps. Plethora of people will live up those steps and bring their garbage up there if it was safe, if they didn't have to go through Crackville or over garbage, like you said. You know, and
I would like to just state that the concern I have, and I don't know the answer to this, is that all those houses in Garden Street, Long Path, and where I've looked and where I'd like to be, you've got the safety issue, but you've also got people, I mean, we have had this discussion where you want to restore, keep the families there. Most of the people living on Long Path are renters of absentee landlords.
I can tell you the
families are tied up in probate, or in the piece of property I looked at, the families were exploding the price of this piece of land for whatever reason.
Nostalgia.
And they, and so a ruin, you know, is way overpriced, so nobody's going to buy it. And then they're upset because of quote unquote gentrification, and I don't know what else to call it, of somebody coming in with money who's willing to pay that extra, you know, that extra price to have that and restore it, and then they get mad because they've displaced someone else. I don't know what the answer is, because if these people won't live there and they rent it out, or if they do live there and don't have the money to restore or maintain, what can we do? The government can't come in and just...
Part of the answer is like a better cooperation between the various government agencies that have things to do with that. Property and procurement. Other places, for instance, the probate issue is huge. It's not the only place that it's huge, it's elsewhere.
It's getting better, I understand.
Other places have counselors for people that go through these situations. They get the people together, get the spokesperson for the group, and slowly but surely help them through it. Demolition by neglect. Everything that we're trying to do here has been done everywhere else for many, many years. Some places successful, some places not successful. But what
But
They
they
were born
probably a funded preservation book.
Of course. But what people like Mr. Uema and Mr. Bourne and everybody says that, yeah, now is a really good opportunity. With 3 months into a new administration, Larry Bushholder, Island Administrator, has been to historic preservation. We're in conversation with property and procurement. There's going to be a new director for code enforcement, etc., etc. We still have, luckily, Ms. Magena, and you know, people start working together and then pushing into that direction. The towns, you know, they're going to benefit. I can smell it. I've seen it. I think it's, you know, the last few years, I think really we're doing the right thing.
Well, you know, you said a great word there. That there, you know, we almost need counselors, right? We need a go between government and private sector.
Maybe community development.
Well, I have a solution. You know, I'm very critical, I'm very outspoken, but I'm also a problem solver. And you know, I'm going to ask this question to you. What do you call a small town with a university in it? Does anyone know? You call it a university town, a college town. And that, to me, is the real glue that could come in between, you know. One, it gives kids an education. It gives them the skills to compete, and it also can be the binding economic driver of putting people into the workplace, but also negotiating some of the political, and that in itself is a conundrum, the politics in itself. So if you look at how college or universities act in a small town, they act in that capacity, and they bridge gaps and solve a lot of problems. So, you know, my hope was that you know, this new administration in the university would do that. It's slightly disappointing in many respects. I think that CVI acted more like a university than the University of the Virgin Islands is acting.
I have to say that the University of the Virgin Islands, and as we talk about college towns, Christiansted, in their plan coming up from that charrette was to create a college town with an extension of UVI in the historic town itself.
Every town.
That is their plan.
Should have a finger of it.
And the University of the Virgin Islands has been very open to that discussion. They are actively looking at how they can implement that. We have even talked very lightly about it happening in Charlotte, Mali as well, because their goal and their mandate is to reach out to the people of the territory. And so this is the things that they're looking at. So don't think that it hasn't happened. They are working on doing that actively in places that have a plan, has already created that plan, and has a systematic way of going about it. So Christiansted's plan has been created. It was one of the 2 ideas that came out of the charrettes, and it was the winning idea that was pushed forward.
It doesn't need to happen in just one place, so it should just happen all over.
One thing you said, I think, and other people have said about getting that, and you said the identity of the island, I don't think that can happen in the Virgin Islands because of our diversity and all of our transientness, unless you have it come from the government and they instill a pride in all of us, to, you know, for picking up and keeping the place clean and learning things so that they can tell tourists. All of that has to come from the top down. I don't think, because we're so diverse, I don't think it can work.
When we look to an institution for guidance, it doesn't always have to be government, you know?
No, I know, but when you think about campaigns like Keep America Beautiful, that they did, that was driven from the top, from the president. The president's wife was the one who started that, and it coordinated everybody in the United States and changed the image of the landscape. And sometimes you need that leadership from the top to actually say, this is how it's going to be done, everyone, and really impress upon the legislature And then everyone can have a sense of unity under that leader.
Yes.
Not to deny that we need a lot of coming up from the
Strong,
bottom.
visionary leadership is an asset, no matter how you cut it. And we need that, okay? All right? We have it at times, we have it at different levels.
Well,
okay?
I was
But
at
I want to interject just one comment here, okay? That I think this is all great discussion. And I think that we need to remember that we need to put our journey into context. That we are only 100 years since transfer and dealing with all the problems we're talking about. Some of them have roots further back, but we're really dealing with our current problems that have developed over the course of 100 years.
So we are young.
We are young. We are in a process.
America.
Where we are is not the end result, okay? We are part of history. Of the journey. And we, our public, private institutions, and all of us as individuals, to some degree, are in control of our future, you know? That's all. So when we talk about, oh, it's the way it is, and nobody's going to ever pick up the galvanizer, so, you know, eventually the galvanizer will get picked up.
I can. I would have carried it a long time ago if I could get it.
Right. You know, but things are fluid.
See, and
We're just a link in the
opportunity of a place like this. And the reason I'm happy in a place like this, because I can pick up my own garbage. I can take a rotten old house and fix it up. And I've done it over and over again, and it's not a problem. And all we need is tons of people to do that. And you would have a beautifully clean town.
That's right.
I figure if I see the trash on the floor and I don't pick it up, I'm just as bad as the person that put it there.
Well,
Yeah.
But that's not a campaign that's understood here. That's not an ethos that's understood here.
But the more
It's
people
something that
that do it,
can be taught.
I'm not sure about that.
I disagree. It's getting better, obviously.
If you drive around
people behind
downtown,
you that you don't see, they're trying to raise their hands. Interject. Priscilla?
No, I just want to piggyback on a few comments. I think that, yes, we are all responsible. Each and every one of us should take responsibility for the community that we're living in, regardless of our roots, if we arrived yesterday or 500 years ago. And, you know, on the note that you just mentioned, we are a very young government. We just got the right to vote for our governor, and, you know, Melvin Evans in 1969, 70. You know, we're a very young government. So I think we've made great strides. I mean, I remember walking down, you know, Main Street as a young child, and it was a very dynamic town. You know, Back Street was very dynamic. There was a lot of commerce taking place there. You know, the newspaper used to be on Back Street. You know, Zora's used to be on Back Street. You know, I would go to the Edinburgh Library after school. I would leave Catholic school and I went to the library. However, you know, we also had to negotiate the tourists that were also sharing the town with us. So I remember getting photographed, you know, in my school uniform as if I were, you know, sort of a puppet. And I thought it was fun. You know, they thought that we were cute and we interacted with the tourists.
Probably were.
I
was there.
So, you know, and back then we did have a degree of cruise ships coming to our harbor. The cruise ships seem to be getting bigger and bigger, more people, and they stay here less and less. They're here not 8 hours, they're here more like 6 hours. And the cruise ship industry really does hog our tourism economy here in the territory. They have mega malls, they have mega food courts, they charge thousands and thousands of dollars to be sponsored, you know, or talked about, you know, if you have a shop downtown, you know, so we really need to look at that part of our tourism economy. You know, we, as
Uema bluntly said, we may be very well hoarding ourselves to that type of economy within our tourism product that maybe is not the healthiest. You have had an experience, you know, of having pop-up exhibitions in Yacht Haven Grand, and I do get a good combination of our local population as well as a few tourists. And it's interesting to see their reactions. The tourists, for the most part, it's our cultural town or, you know, engage with the local population, and it's rushed and it's not a fulfilling experience, I don't think, for the tourists or for us as, you know, Virgin Islanders. So
Well, that industry's growing, so you're stuck.
well, I don't agree with that. I think that we can be empowered to have certain controls over that tourism economy. I think that we also need to look at how we can use preservation as a tool to build on our tourism economy. Preservation development is a good thing. We can preserve and develop and build and not be always stuck on downtown Charlotte Amalie. This building, for example, here in our Tutu district is a wonderful example of a historical building. So sometimes we also need to look out from our historical towns to look at other ways that we can bring, you know, our history to not only tourists, but to our own community.
That's a really good point, and also that we have to as history moves forward, we have to reinterpret and reassess what we consider to be historic. You know? And when we add more recent elements to our historical listings, you know, we also add sites that have more current relevance, because people kind of remember them. Okay. Interesting, we do have some legislation that has to change. Okay. Unfortunately, in our preservation guidelines right now, we are limited to considering a historic element worthy of National Register or Territorial Registry as it has to relate to colonial architecture. The term is actually used in our laws, okay?
And what is the definition of that?
Well, your guess is as good as mine. It depends upon whether you only consider the Danish period colonial or whether you accept the fact that the American period is still a continuation of colonialism, okay? Right, yeah. But unfortunately, that's a bit of a conundrum politically because there are people who do not like, who see colonialism or colonial situation as a very bad term, that will argue that we are not a colony. Okay. But we either have to change the wording in that regulation or accept the interpretation that if we're going to put buildings like the Navy buildings or the Army buildings down to subbase, Bournefield buildings, hundreds of buildings that are historic now to us, but aren't Danish colonial period, right? Yeah, the town of Cruz Bay is a perfect example. I mean, I did a National Register survey to identify the historic sites in Cruz Bay and determine whether Cruz Bay was eligible as a historic district. And I believe it is. It should be our 5th historic district in the territory, right? But one of the problems is that if you're going to define it as a historic district, a lot of the buildings that are historic within it are post-transfer buildings.
Built by Virgin Islands.
Built by Virgin Islands, yeah. So
Well, and that's
we need to think about
the
interpretations.
The struggle of all, I think, historic districts is determining what is the year or the period that they're trying to emulate. Where I have a house up in the States is in a historic district. And I said, well, what is the period? It's Victorian, but what does that mean to you? You know, is that 1850 or is that 1898 or what? And then when they look at the town, it may vary because they have a 1960 house building. It's exactly what you're talking about. And it's very difficult. And that's why I asked you that question about, is it defined by the building and
Right.
all of that.
Actually, I gotta go. I just want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I gotta run too.
Okay.
I'll see you. Good night, everyone.
I'll just close from my standpoint. This will be my last word. But in relating to that, the Historic Preservation Commission right now is engaged in trying to convert, for adaptive reuse, some buildings within our historic district that we feel are being demolished by neglect. Okay? And we have focused in on buildings that are not in the private sector, but are in the government sector. Okay? Because the government of the Virgin Islands does own a number of properties in downtown, in our historic district, that would be, if they were in private hands, we'd be all over them for demolition of by neglect. Okay? So we're saying, well, let's take some of these buildings and set an example. Okay? Let's make public-private partnerships. Let's turn them over for adaptive, controlled adaptive reuse, overseen by the Historic Preservation Commission. Right? One of those buildings is the Hamburg American Line building. Do we all know which one that is?
Which one?
The Hamburg American Line building.
The Hamburg
American Line building. It's that big edifice on the corner across from Vendors Plaza and the waterfront on Kings Wharf.
Oh, the old Superior Court building?
The old district court building. Right, yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Or
Right.
how about the police
Well,
station?
so now here's the problem though. Here's the problem. Is that that's a modern building.
Yeah.
It was built at the very end of the Danish period, and not by Danes, but by Germans, okay? In a style that is a modern German style for the period. It was a very forward-thinking building, okay? The historic background behind it is fascinating. Okay? So, we had a group of visiting Danes here a few weeks ago. And they were involved in architecture and furniture and surveying Danish history of the town and so on. And I was invited to a social function to meet with them. And they're scholars, you know, and they're preservation advocates. And they love our historic district. And I expressed to this young woman that, well, currently we're working on this project that I described to you. And one of the buildings we would like to see preserved is the Hamburg American Line building. And all of a sudden her face dropped and her eyes got wide and she said, oh, but that's an awful building. It didn't conform to her idea of what was Danish colonial architecture, and therefore we're preserving within our town.
And it happens in other islands too. Right. So the Dominican Republic, in Santo Domingo, the architects have said to me that when the Haitians was occupying at that time, they built galleries and porches and stuff like that, not in the way that the Spanish would accept them. And so, historic preservation says, rip them out, they're not historic.
Because they belong to a different culture.
Because they belong to a different culture.
Interesting.
But, you know, the Hamburg American Line building was only just built when transfer occurred. And because, it's ironic, because these young Danes that were here were studying the furniture that was removed from government buildings and taken back to Denmark at transfer. Apparently they've just uncovered a whole cache, I've forgotten, 80 crates or something, of Danish furniture that had been removed, even though it was agreed that they wouldn't remove from the government house and so on, okay? But apparently the Danes came in and they took it all with them. When the Americans arrived, Governor Oliver and his buddies looked around and they said, we can't set up government in government house. We don't even have a chair to sit in. So they looked around and said, well, what do we got? And oh, there's this building here that was owned by the Germans, and we're at war with the Germans. So they ended up actually confiscating the building as an American War Prize, imprisoning the Hamburg American Line director and sending him to the States to be in a detention camp for the rest of World War I, okay? And occupied the American the Hamburg American Line building. So the Hamburg American Line is our first governmental headquarters of the United States, Virgin Islands of the United States.
Good story.
So there is historical history.
Yeah.
That definitely has historical value.
And what's interesting is that building still belongs to the federal government. And it was one of the first buildings put on the National Register of Historic Places in the Virgin Islands.
You know,
And that was done at a federal level, not a local.
And I don't know what you're working on now, but I know as a member of our Rotary Club, who's an engineer, worked with several Rotary clubs to try and negotiate with the government to make that a welcoming center with lockers and, you know, water and resting area, you know, seat.
Was it Paul Ferreras?
It was.
Paul was in there, Paul was, Greg Miller, just a whole bunch of Rotarians that were involved in that.
But wasn't it the visitor center before?
No, it was the Superior Court.
No, it was next to it.
The visitor center's next to it, but they wanted to make it a bigger one. And they wanted Rotary, and Rotary was willing to, was at that time willing to man it and, you know, be the welcoming people. It would give tourists a place to store their baggage if they want to walk, you know, walk through town before they go to the airport, you know, give them water, bathrooms, you know, places to sit. And the problem came up that, first of all, the government was non-functioning or whatever, not able to come to an agreement, and two, there were some structural issues. And so it became kind of out of the question for money, you know, a money issue.
Matt's an engineer and builder. Matt, is that building stable?
Yeah, but you know, the whole thing about when anybody looks at a building like that, any kind of historic rehabilitation is a technical and economic problem. I mean, it's something that you have to do.
Can you fix it? Cheaper than you could rebuild it?
Well, yeah, you'd have to tear it down. That's a nice cost right there. How much concrete is in that building?
A lot.
There's like there's a pad there, the size of the building underground, that's 3 feet thick of concrete.
Wow.
On concrete piles driven down into the base.
Yeah.
We have the descriptions from the architect.
But see, that's always an issue in historic preservation, and that's always an issue in economic development. How much does the building cost? How much do I have to put in it? It's always something. All of those things have to be weighed, and the value, you know, will just come out of it. It'll just evolve. That's what we're trying to work with the government to see. And in these buildings that we're talking about that are sort of being demolished by neglect, the only way that we can see to saving them is to letting them go to the private sector for a long-term lease at an extremely favorable rate to justify an investment that will eventually yield a return. And the return's got to be not just for the investor, the return has to be for the government in terms of taxes and such as, you know, grocery receipts, property taxes, and general
and
economic
value
activities.
to the community, and then we end up with a...
And then the value to the community. But that is the case with every building, every historic building, whether it's publicly or privately owned. Most of us own some of them, and we always battle the same questions. Banks don't loan as easily to a historic building as they do to new construction. I mean, the issues are forever. They're difficult, but there are people that know how to do it.
Now, one of the concerns I have about downtown and revitalization and all, and he talked about it in terms of not having, you know, the doctors, the pharmacies, the grocery stores and stuff down there. I just talked to, for instance, the fish spa people, Caribbean fish spa people at American Yacht Harbor. And they're trying to find a place downtown. Every single place they went, the rent was so high because it's the kind of rent you can get from jewelry stores. The fear I have is that after a while, this is going to burn out and the jewelry stores won't be cutting it as much anymore. And maybe your natural evolution of the town will get back to with these kinds of stores and things that the services that are needed. But I said, well, what about down by where Magic Ice is? She goes, oh, well, then that's on the edge and it's not as, delivered.
She needs to be more creative and think out of the box. If she wants to be in the town, understand that the town is not just Cardo to Atrice or Cardo to Radixana.
Right.
She needs to think about the whole town.
She's thinking too about the tourists and I said, and then you're looking at either Crown Bay or Havenside,
and so we
or
need to go back
someplace
to go back and think about it. Traditionally, our butchery and our fish market was down on I-Levine Street.
On the west.
Right, on the western side of the town. And people walked and went there.
Right.
If she would service the local population, she would be more successful with her tourist population.
Well, and her feet. Well, the thing is, I don't know that her business is going to be that business, but
we have somebody back here who's been wanting to share.
Well, when you're talking about doing a public, all right, the Historic Preservation Commission is trying to focus on getting, according to what you say, getting government buildings back into service. My pet peeve is get the Enigba Library building back into service before it becomes a huge rehabilitation effort. That building pegs that end of town and our lovely market, which is underutilized. That building needs to be opened up for civic purposes, perhaps some tourism stuff, whatever it is, but it is just sitting there closed up, and I cannot,
It's true. Well, on that note, I would like to interject. I think one of the things that is lacking in our tourism product and our local product as well, because I think it's something that we as a community can benefit from as well, is not having museums of any real caliber. Art museums, historical museums, museums that look at our, boating and fishing heritage, or our carnival heritage. I mean, there's so many opportunities that we can create exhibition spaces and shared community spaces, both for our tourists and for our own benefit as a community.
Isn't the fort going to be that?
Pardon me?
Isn't the fort going to be that?
The fort can't be all of that.
No, that's true.
No,
the fort's
not going to be that.
No, the fort's not going to be
that. Bringing art and cultural activities into our component of town leads to that more authentic tourist experience. And it also helps to invigorate our town, because I don't know how many of you go to the pop-up gallery exhibits that Priscilla has been putting on, but I am stunned and amazed when I go there. The turnout and the cross-section of our local population. I never have gone to events in the Virgin Islands that draw the kind of unbelievable just cross-section of our community.
A lot of talent, a lot of different
that art does, that those art exhibits does. If we had most towns, most cities in the world have a cultural and arts district, and bringing in the educational component, the university component. Maybe we could have, maybe they should move part of their arts program into an arts district in town.
The University of the Virgin Islands, there isn't even an arts program that does oil painting.
I also have to say that
Universities
up street, which would be everything from Garden Street up to Hospital Ground, is working on their plan right now. And they have indicated in their charrette series that they are looking at doing those vernacular type museum ideas where they can tell about their sports history and their carnival history separate from the sports history, because carnival the parade always terminated in upstreet. And so they are looking at that as their economic spiral to really rejuvenate their community.
Frenchtown has done it. And look at the product that's generated in the French community. They have their own museum and a destination in town.
One of the problems with an art gallery or an art museum is the cruise ships will not allow their tourists to go to art galleries, art museum on the island. The cruise ship tours, they was going to do an art tour. No, you can't do an art tour because they sell paintings, they do these auctions on the ships to sell paintings. So the cruise ship people won't allow cruise ship passengers to go to art.
So here's how you do it.
This is our destination.
Yeah. But this is
we
how
want
we
to
do it.
have some controls over that.
You have to talk to the cruise ship people.
But I think the challenge is that, you know, when we look at other islands, and I do a good amount of cruising, I've gone to the Bahamas where we stayed a little later in port. And when we stayed a little later, we were able to go to an area that was open at that time period, and it was just restaurants, all local restaurants. There must have been, I think there's 40 something of them in a square. Looks like our village, except they're full-fledged restaurants, and they were all selling local food. I think that what we need to understand, and when you look at Tortola, they don't have the mega cruise ships coming in because they don't have the capacity. But what they have is the larger, the higher end tourists coming in that is spending more money because they have the ability to spend more money. So we need to think about what we want and what we have and really say, listen, we will allow you to stay in for a longer period of time using whatever incentives we have to. But then we have to be ready with the information, with the ideas. There are lots of people. The taxi drivers, some of them are awesome. When they do a tour, it is a tour. There are others, however, that when they give a tour, they'll get on the top of Maflin and say, look down, there is St. Lucia. So we need to really think about what we are offering and be very specific about the experience that we want to give. If we say that, the cruise ships will go along. They want their tourists. They want their tourists to come.
Yeah, but it's not that simple. Because if I recall correctly, as a child, the cruise ships did stay here. That's when downtown had a vibrant restaurant.
That's necessary.
And
yeah, you can
however, if I recall correctly, and I may be wrong about this, when the casino industry and the casino issue came into play, you know, there was casinos that were starting to become very popular on the cruise ships. And as the cruise ships got bigger, the casinos got bigger, and there was a lot of discourse about, oh, we don't want casinos, which I personally think was the right thing. But the cruise ship industry wants to make the most amount of money. They, in all honesty, they care very little about the destinations they go to. And so, since they were told that they couldn't have gaming in port, they said, okay, we're leaving early so we could go out.
The law hasn't changed.
But then it was, what, 10, 15 years later, and now we don't have that infrastructure anymore that we used to have where there were tons of restaurants downtown. So now we may want to go back to the table and renegotiate with the cruise industry and look at how we can revitalize the town to make it more engaging. You know, I don't know what the solution is. However, I know that the cruise industry has way more control over us than we have over them.
Because they got a lot, they can go elsewhere.
There is a dynamic and change where we go through a period where the scale of something meets the scale of the destination. There was a time when the scale of cruise ship visitation and the scale of the cruise ships met the scale that we could handle and service. The problem is we've allowed the scale of the influx to go beyond what we can legitimately service. And we don't have the infrastructure to support those quantities. We could have a better, more effective, more unique destination, more authentic destination if we concentrated on scaling our levels of tourism, diversifying it across the board, right? And scaling it to what we can support.
I mean,
it is. I mean, because it has to happen.
Are definitely changing. Yeah. I mean, people from the high-end stores at the front, they are not as, because the people are lowering their rates, what with WAPA and on and other financial issues. There are financial stresses, and there are different kinds of shops. I see a bigger mix lately than traditionally all tourist stores, and I think, T-shop, you know what I mean? I mean, stuff is happening, and I think that if you continue to push along the boundaries, as we were trying to do, into the neighborhoods, into Long Path, into around the field and Savannah, etc. If you continue to improve and make the buildings, make people live downtown. You got to find affordable housing. You got to find parking. None of the issues have changed for the last 25 years. We got to find ways of having better parking. We got to find ways of regulating traffic, such as maybe stickers. I've always advocated parking stickers, resident stickers for the downtown. That's never happened. But that kind of stuff, is what'll make a real community. And it's always the community that drives it. Yes. It's always the people that live in the place, that talk to the neighbors, that walk the dogs, and watch the kids play. That is how the thing works. And I'm very, very depressed that, I used to be able to buy my newspaper in the old hotel, Grand Hotel, but I can't do that anymore because everybody reads the newspaper on the internet, so.
This is why Nadine's programs that really are putting boots in the ground and interacting with the local neighborhoods, that's why that's so important.
But what's
and that's the
happening
future.
to our community isn't unique to the Virgin Islands. It's not unique to the greater Caribbean region. I was in Venice a couple of years ago. Big signs protesting the huge influx of cruise ships into Venice because the infrastructure of Venice just couldn't or don't want to sustain, the masses of people going through their community. For a short period of time. Yes, they want tourism, but not to the degree that is happening. And so, but it's taking that community effort, as you just mentioned, to really, be local and come together and try to empower ourselves to make changes.
The industry is growing. That thing, the cruise ship industry, you can try to control it and stuff like that. It's way above my pay grade. I'm not familiar with it at all, but you're not going to stop that sucker. That is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the ships are going to get bigger. Yeah. It's just, it is what it is. The little ones are going to be phased out. The bigger ones, it is a very, very important industry to the Virgin Islands. It's a huge part of the GDP.
We choose not to ruin our harbor in order to get the bigger ones. We can go, oh well, the big ones can't come.
Well, no, I mean, we don't seem to have the guts to just say no about some of this stuff. It's like, oh, wait, we have to build something else. And the cruise ships run the whole scheduling of the shipping through the entire Caribbean. And it's not just St. Thomas who should complain. Every single port that does stuff that has tourism ought to actually cooperate. God forbid, because we're competitors. But all the ships have to leave port on such and such a day, and they all have to get back on such and such a day, because that's the cruise ships want to schedule it that way. Why they can't stagger Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday departures? That way we won't have 6 one day and none the next day. We might have 2 and 2 and 2 and 2, like that. And so it's St. Lucia and St. Martin, instead of having these big amounts one time and none the next day. That way you're straining your infrastructure one day, and the next day people are unemployed. Why can't we just sort of even it out? All through.
Good night.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
So we wrapped up?
I think so.
Looks so